It's a very important session today, my dear friends, and it's going to take us a while, but I hope you will be patient and you will follow the arguments. I'm looking at a critique of the methodology of Quran, and it's very important that we look at what scholars, the critique of scholars, or of at least of people with a good level of understanding and knowledge, so that we can confirm or assure ourselves that we are not misunderstanding these important things. And so inshallah, I hope you will enjoy the session with me today, and it will be probably more than an hour. I think it ended up being an hour and a half, and inshallah I certainly enjoyed making it for you. It took me the better part of a day, and I think it was worth it. Inshallah, you will enjoy.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستهديه ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأن محمدا عبده ورسوله. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be on you, my dear friends. I want to respond to a critique on the methodology of the Quran as an epistemic approach to knowledge, and we'll look at a critique that was made on the methodology of the Quran, and it's a discussion by a few brothers, few fairly capable intellectual brothers. So I like to respond to the critique raised by these brothers, and we should not expose our work to the critique of less intellectual, less modest understanding of the issue, but rather we should look at the critique of those who have a more in-depth understanding of the issues, and I believe that these guys have such an understanding. So I'm going to look at their critique and respond to it, and I'd like to say that up front that my observation or my response to their critique, and I will pay careful attention to every word they say, is an honest one. It is in an attempt to arrive at what is most rational, most logical, and which I feel that I am doing justice to the issues at stake, to my creator, and that I am not fooling around trying to score points. So I'm going to be very, very honest about the response to the critique, and you can be the judge of that. Please, in the comments, if you think that I'm slipping up, let me know.
And that's of course probably going to be because of what you saw as explicit references in the Quran, that there is no other guide besides Allah's words, or something to that effect, right?
Yeah, and then the Quran claims to be, clear, sufficient as a guide.
Yeah.
It's fully detailed. It's an explanation of all things. It's the best hadith. All these different kind of things. I actually truly thought that the Quran was telling me, as well as other believers, that all we needed was the Quran, and that's it. We didn't need. There's no secondary source whatsoever.
Great. So, I mean, I guess, logically speaking, right? And I don't know if Brother Farid would agree that, I mean, if it is the case that Allah says in the Quran that you do not need the Sunnah, I mean, let's assume it's as explicit as that, then clearly, then we don't need the Sunnah, right?
If Allah, listen what he says, if Allah says in the Quran, you do not need the Sunnah, then it would be clear, then we would accept it. The problem is that what he's asking is for Allah to deny his take on Sunnah. You see, the Quran does not contain negative injunctions necessarily. It doesn't say that you don't need this and you don't need that, and because then there would be an infinite list. The Quran doesn't say you don't need the Kabbalah. The Quran doesn't say you don't need the Vedas, the Vedic scriptures. You see, the Quran doesn't tell you of scriptures and traditions that you don't need. It tells you what you do need. And let's just quickly look at what does the Quran say, in fact, about the word Sunnah. Look at this verse here, 33, 38, where the word Sunnah appears in the Quran. Allah says, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Ma kana ala an-nabi min harajin fima faradallahu lah. Sunnatullahi fil ladhina khalaw min qablu wa kana amrullahi qadran maqdura. There can be no difficulty to the Prophet in what Allah has indicated to him as a duty. It was the practice, there's the word sunnah, sunnatillah, it was the practice approved of Allah amongst those of old that have passed away. So it was the practice of Allah, sunnatillah fil ladina khalaw, the practice of those of old that have passed away, and the command of Allah is a decree determined. وَكَانَ أَمْرُ اللَّهِ قَدْرًا مَقْدُورًا. Now, clearly what we are seeing in this verse is that the sunnat of Allah is something that predates the Prophet. It predates the Prophet. It is an ancient sunnat. It is a sunnat that is pre-human, in fact. And it refers to the natural state of affairs, the decreed way of doing things, the way that has the satisfaction and the approval of Allah. And that is the sunnat. Now you need to distinguish that idea of sunnat from 500,000 stories or tales or fables that come via various chains of narration through fallible human beings and decreeing parallel decrees in parallel, in competition with the Quran and the word of Allah, because some of these decrees are clearly in competition with Allah. For example, the decree to stone the adulterous woman, it's in competition with the book of Allah that stipulates a ruling around adulterous relationships. So it is in fact a parallel sunnat, a sunnat that is not grounded and intrinsic to the book and to the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what we have to be aware of is when these brothers, who I believe are intellectuals, are going to speak about the word sunnat, it's a non-starter, because the word sunnat in their minds is not the sunnat of Allah. It is a tradition which they have pre-formulated or pre-assumed along different lines, in a different sense, with a different meaning. They understand that to be the sunnat ir-rasul, which is a very common phrase in the Muslim mind, but there is no sunnat ar-rasul. You can go and look in the Quran, that term does not appear in the Quran. The only term that you will see in the Quran is the term sunnatillah, or the sunnat of the ancients, you see. And so there is no injunction or instruction for you to follow sunnat ar-rasul. There is an instruction to obey the Prophet, because the Prophet is seen to be in obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Think it is, but I guess to start from the very foundation, let's try and define sunnah, Brother Farid. If you could just give us a working definition for what sunnah is.
Well, linguistically, it means the path or the way. Among the scholars, they would say a sunnah is not the fard, but rather like any excuse me, what's the word I'm looking for? Like any thing that's like mustahab, anything that's recommended act. But generally the Sunnah includes the statements, actions, physical description of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his approvals. That's what generally the Sunnah is.
Okay, I need to just stop there because he's given a definition of what Sunnah means, right? So I do think that we need to challenge that definition, because it's not as if the word Sunnah does not appear in the Quran. It's not as if that word is undefined in the Quran. That term, the word Sunnah, appears in the Quran at many places, and let's look at some of those places. Yeah, I've done a search here. There's the word Sunnah, and it's a simple app. You just type the name in, Sunnah, SNN, Sin Nun Nun, and you get all the occurrences of that word, Sunnah. So alhamdulillah, in today's world, it's been made much easier to understand the Quran. So there's the word Sunnah. It occurs 16 times in that particular form, Sunnah, 16 times. Now I'm going to challenge you, all these 16 times, to find one of them that says Sunnat al-Rasul, or one of them that says the Sunnat is what that brother just said now, is that it is the practices and the agreements and the words of the Prophet. Just find one. I'm going to take a few random out. The time doesn't allow me to go to each and every one. قَدْ خَلَتْ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ سُنَنٌ فَسِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَانْظُرُوا. You see, it doesn't use that Sunnat al-Rasul there. Sunnat min qad arsalna qablaka min rusulina. This has been the practice of Allah with all those messengers we sent before you, and will not find any change in our way. The Sunnat of the ancient prophets, right? Of all the messengers. There's no reference to the Hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad. There's no connection between the two, the words and the sayings of the Prophet. ما منع الناس أن يؤمنوا إذ جاءهم الهدى سنة الأولين. And nothing prevented the people from embracing faith and imploring forgiveness from their Lord while guidance had reached them, except waiting for the pattern of the ancients' destruction occurring to them, on that the torment should come in front of them. Still nothing to do with the Sunnah. Sunnatullah fil ladhina khalaw min qabli, right? We've just looked at that one. Sunnatullah, again speaking about the Sunnat of Allah. Again, the Sunnat of Allah, stakbaran fil ardi wa illa Sunnat al-awwalin, the Sunnat of the ancients. فَلَنْ تَجِدْ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ تَبْدِيلًا. The ancient Sunnat of Allah, you will find no change in it, or no alteration in it. Alright? وَلَنْ تَجِدْ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ تَحْوِيلًا. The Sunnat of Allah, the ancient tradition of Allah, the way of Allah, you will not find it being twisted or reshaped or changed. Sunnatillahi allati qad khalat fi ibadi. The Sunnat of Allah again here, right? Sunnatillah, again the Sunnat of Allah here again, the established way, the way of Allah. So, my brothers, I've looked at all of them. And I'm sincerely looking for guidance, and I cannot find Sunnat al-Rasul. Now you tell me, listen to this brother, right? And tell me if what he says tallies with what you just saw in the Quran. It's
very, foundation. Let's try and define Sunnah, Brother Farid. If you could just give us
let's
a
hear
working
again.
definition.
It's your
for
second
what
time what he
is.
says. You've seen the definition
Well,
from the
linguistically,
Quran.
it means the path or the way. Among the scholars, they would say a Sunnah is not the fard, but rather like any excuse me, what's the word I'm looking for? Like any thing that's like mustahab, anything that's
recommended
recommended act. But generally, the Sunnah includes the statements, actions, physical description of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his approvals. That's what generally the Sunnah is.
So, I just want you to then reflect, you see, because we are here to seek the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what he just said was that he quotes the scholars. When he tries to define the word sunnah, he quotes that is what the scholars say. What I've done is I've gone to the Quran and looked up the word sunnah and tried to understand the meaning of the word sunnah, which is not ambiguous. It comes out very, very clearly. If you look at those verses that I've just showed you, the 15 or 18 occurrences, it gives a very clear indication as to what the word sunnah means. It's an ancient way, the required way, the intended way that people and the world should function in alignment with the will of the creator of the universe. And that is the sunnah. I showed you that there's absolutely no place in the Quran where it refers to the sunnah of Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. Now, I'm not saying the Quran doesn't say you mustn't obey the Prophet, because that is a clear injunction, Ati'u Allah wa Ati'u Rasul. But there's no injunction to follow the sunnah of the Prophet. There's nothing like that. And what these brothers are saying is they are going to the scholars' opinion before they look at the Quran. And the position that I'm advancing and defending here is that we should have the Quran as our a priori source of guidance, the a priori source of guidance, before you go to any other scholar, book, tradition, whatever. If you want to study the Vedas or the Talmud or the Kabbalah, whatever, you have to put those things at the back of the queue. The Quran is the first source of guidance. Now, I've done that now with the word sunnah already, epistemically, in terms of establishing the credentials of what we regard as truth. We have to place the Quran right in front and not at the back, right? So what this brother has done is he's already put the Quran in the back. He's not even cared to consult the meaning of the Quran when it comes to the idea of the Sunnah.
Yeah, and so from the Quran's perspective, obviously, he's going to need evidence from the Quran that the Sunnah is authoritative, and obviously, so would we. So I guess I'll throw this question out to the three of you. What evidence do we have from the Quran that we have to establish the Sunnah? So maybe we can start with the brother Sharif.
And now they've made the wrong assumption of what Sunnah is.
Okay, inshallah. Jazakallah khair. So just before that, I just wanted to also...
So they are now operating on a wrong assumption about the word Sunnah, right? So he is, just now he's misdefined the word Sunnah as being the Hadiths, which is not, there's no inference. You cannot make that inference. You cannot make that deduction from the Quran, right? So, but now they've created a pre-assumption wrongfully, so now they are going to try and prove the mistaken assumption.
Just quickly mention the motivations that I sense, and obviously there are going to be different people with different motivations in terms of rejecting the Sunnah. But in the experiences that I've had, which is, I've met people for the last over 20 years or so who've rejected the Sunnah, it generally is because they see a contradiction between...
You see, now just rejecting the Sunnah is a very defamatory thing to say, because nobody can reject the Sunnah of Allah. How can we reject the Sunnah of Allah, the natural disposition or the fitratillah, the way that Allah wants the world to be? How can we reject that? So, but we have to keep our meanings clear. They are conflating now that idea of what Sunnah is with the books and with the Hadiths and the Bukharis and the Kulainis and all these books. So can you see there's a clever maneuver has taken place in your mind? So you feel offended if somebody tells you you're not following the Sunnah. I am very much following the Sunnah. I love the Sunnah. The Sunnah of Allah, as stated in the Quran, is a primary principle for me. But when they use the word Sunnah now, they've carefully shifted the meaning now.
the West, sort of the society that they live in, and the values and the ethics of the society that they live in, which is mainly a liberal secular society, and what Islam teaches. And they're trying to reconcile the two, because liberalism has become this paradigm by which they sort of view everything. You know, if it's going to be good, it's in accordance to sort of liberal secular capitalist values. If it's bad, it's going against that, going against human rights, etc. And so what some Muslims do is when they come across a hadith or certain rulings which they find that contradicts with their particular mindset, for them, for some of them, the ones that I've come across, they try to discard the hadith because it gives them more.
He's now moved on, and now suddenly the Sunnah has become the Hadith. Note, they have never established in their introduction, this is just the introduction, that Hadith equals the Sunnah. That is not stated in the Quran. You know, Hadiths are stories. They are narrations, 500,000 of them in various books. Some of them are strong, some of them are weak, and it's a massive challenge to sift through them. And you need to go on the word of the scholars, you need to go on the word of the Sahabis, you need to go on the word of other men. It's an extremely human process, fraught with the possibility of error. Unlike the Quran, which is a direct revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the Prophet, recorded, translated or transferred in multiple parallel forms from the time of the original to the present. So what we have here is we now have a change in the meaning of the word Sunnah, which is away from what the Quran indicates. And secondly, we now have a sudden connection between the word Sunnah and Hadith. Let's continue.
Wriggle room in order to sort of interpret the Quran to fit within the standard, you know, narrative, received opinion of the societies that we live in. So sometimes the discussion really isn't about the particular text per se, because I think the text is pretty clear within the Quran. You have many verses of Quran, like for example, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in, I think it's Surah An-Nisa verse 59, "O you who believe, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, ati'u Allah wa ati'u Rasulah wa ulil amri minkum." O you, Allah, obey the messenger and those in authority from amongst you. Now I know.
So we get the old verse, ati'u Allah wa ati'u Rasul wa ulil amri minkum. My brothers and sisters, again, the verse doesn't say anything about the Sunnah. It says obey the Prophet, which is a legitimate and very, very logical command from Allah. He's appointed the messenger, and the messenger comes with instructions. The instructions are contained in the Quran. Every time you read the Quran, you'll see there, Qul, say to the Prophet, Qul illadhina amanu, Qul ya ayyuhalladhina amanu. The Quran constantly tells the Prophet, say to them this, say to them that. And those are the instructions that the Prophet are issuing to the Muslim community of his time. Right? The Muslim community of his time are under the command of the Prophet ﷺ. And he issues various commands and instructions. And we are ordered in the Quran to take the instructions from the Prophet. But now you can't interpret those instructions as automatically 500,000 stories that are told 300 years after the Prophet. You know, because there are many inventions, there are many fallible people with evil agendas that have spoken in the name of the Prophet. In fact, in a previous video, I told you that the enemies took control of the leadership, of the rulership, by 61 after Hijrah, when they killed the grandson of the Prophet. Now these people, they spoke in the name of the Prophet. They called themselves the Amirul Mu'mineen, the Khalifat of the Rasul. They spoke in his name. They lied in his name. So you cannot take the words of those who speak for the Prophet as the Prophet's words. And that is the stretch that we are witnessing. The verse in the Quran says, Ati'u Allah wa ati'u Rasul, obey Allah, obey the Prophet, wa ulil amri minkum, and those charged with authority amongst you. So those who have the command in the Muslim community. And with my previous videos, you will see that those with the command are the righteous imams, are the Imam Imamun Mahdiyin, the A'immat Mahdiyin, the righteous Imams, which is a Quranic term. It is the Imams that rule by Allah's command, that rule by the Quran, that establish righteousness, morality, and upholding the rules and the laws of Allah, and who fear none but Allah, who are not servants to any superpower or to the west or to the east or whatever. These are the A'immat al-Mahdiyin, the rightfully guided Imams. And so they need to be obeyed. But this verse is being taken out to refer to Bukhari, Muslim, Kulaini. I don't see how you can make that connection.
You know, when you present these types of verses to people who reject the Quran, reject the Sunnah, they'll have their own particular interpretations. But there's many dozens of ayat like this that talk about the obligation to follow the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You've also got, you know, mass reportage of hadith of the actual what the Prophet.
There's no verse that says you must follow the hadith, not even one. And I've studied, I've looked, I've read it cover to cover, and I've searched it. There is no verse that says follow the Sunnah or the Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There is no verse like that. There are verses that say you must obey, not dozens, my brothers and sisters. There are some verses, and I've already dealt with this. There are some verses, not dozens of verses. So the Prophet was the leader or the Imam that had to be followed in his time, and after him there will be other leaders or Imams that require our obedience also. So the Sunnah is the Sunnah of Allah, not the Sunnah of the Prophet. The Prophet, he issued the commandments of Allah, which is the Sunnah of Allah, right? He was in command, he had to be obeyed. After him there are the righteous leaders also that will follow. We need to obey them. We need to take orders from them also, if they are those who are rightfully acting in Allah's name and executing the command and the Sunnah of Allah, which is contained in the Quran.
Some said to say follow the Sunnah. You've also got the consensus of the companions as well to say to follow the Sunnah. And you know,
now you see what he's doing now is circular reasoning. He's saying that the Sunnah commands you to follow the Sunnah. That is circular reasoning. You cannot use an object itself to show that you need to use that object as justification for itself. That is what you call circular reasoning. You need to use the primary source, which is an independent source, which is our priori source, the Quran. You need to prove from that Quran that the Hadith books have sacred value. And he is now incorporating the Hadith books to prove that the Hadith books are in fact legitimate.
You know, pretty much all of the scholars throughout history, certainly Orthodox scholars, have all said follow the Sunnah. There may have been ikhtilaf, differences of opinion of what constituted the Sunnah for different scholars, but they all simply accepted this bare minimum. So
no, that's also untrue. You see, there are 200 years of scholarship between the time of the Prophet's passing until the writing of the books of Bukhari. There are 200 years, and in those 200 years you have Abu Hanifa, who does not promote the use of hadiths to establish Quranic knowledge or Islamic knowledge or legal knowledge. Abu Hanifa is not, and Abu Hanifa is 80% of the Muslim world. That's 80% of the Muslim world. Now you know what? Let me offer you this challenge. If we say that Abu Hanifa followed the Sunnah, right? If Abu Hanifa followed, now I'm not talking about the Sunnah, I'm talking about the false idea of Sunnah, the Hadiths. If we say that Abu Hanifa is one of the first jurisprudence experts, why is it that Abu Hanifa predates Bukhari, right? Abu Hanifa predates Bukhari by a century or more, almost a century now, 2 centuries. The Hadith guys came almost 200 years after Abu Hanifa. Why is it, if Abu Hanifa was a man of the Hadiths, as this brother just said now, why is there no Hadiths of Abu Hanifa in Bukhari? Why is Abu Hanifa not filled. I mean, Bukhari should be full of Abu Hanifa's hadith, because 80% of the Muslim world are following Abu Hanifa's fiqh. Do you get what I'm saying?
So that's one evidence, and I'm sure the other brothers will explain the other evidences as well.
So he's just given you evidence, but the evidence amounts to nothing. He's given one verse from the Quran, that's all, Ati'u Allah wa Ati'u Rasul wa ulil amri minkum, that no hadith, no sunnah, nothing in that verse. It says you should follow the instructions of the Prophet, which in no way can be extrapolated or used to infer it is the book of Bukhari and Muslim and any other hadith writer, right, which came 300 years after the Prophet. And then he used the scholars are the proof, and he used the hadiths are the proofs for hadiths. No logic in that. It's a weak argument. It's an argument that only works when you are already believing in hadiths. When you already believe and you want to believe it, then that argument will work on you. But if you are like me, you take your Quran seriously, you take your religion, your deen seriously, you take the problems of the world seriously, and you're not here to toe the line with scholars and traditions, then it does not convince me. And it's not going to convince any non-Muslims. It's not going to convince atheists. It's not going to convince Christians. We're only going to have an insular bubble where we believe our own stories. And we will be stuck in that if we don't break out of that false sense of belief and understanding.
But Brother Farid, I mean, so that Quranic evidence, right? That we need to establish the Sunnah, and that the Prophet is authoritative alongside the Quran. I mean, is it clear cut?
The Prophet is authoritative alongside the Quran. My brothers and sisters, please, this is the very definition of Ishraku Billah. It is to invent and to instill parallel authorities with Allah. There is nothing alongside Allah. There are only those who are in agreement and in obedience to Allah. And if you create in your mind the idea that there is Allah's law, which is the Quran, and there is the Sunnah, which is the parallel system, as this brother said, in a parallel or next to Allah, so then you've already split. You've already split the authority of Allah, because now you have the authority of Allah and the authority of the Rasul. There is only the authority of Allah. There is no authority to the Rasul except that authority which he temporarily holds under the command of Allah.
Follow them. So it is binding evidence, and in many verses, Shafi'i mentions multiple verses, verses that speak about reciting in the Hikmah, and that there are verses that imply that the Hikmah is something that has been revealed. Now, the Hikmah in itself, the wisdom, is something that has been revealed. It's something that is taught. It is something that is to be written.
I think we'll make a search of that word Hikmah, because I want to do justice to the brother here. He's saying that we should follow the Hikmah. So I'm going to quickly do a search on that word, and we'll see what we come up with. So let us look at the verses on Hikmah. Here we go. 20 times the word Hikmah. يُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةِ وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ الْعَزِيزُ الْحَكِيمُ. The Prophet teaches them the Quran and Hikmah. Right? Now again, you try and make the connection between that and the Hadith books 300 years after the Prophet. Because if the Prophet had any books in his own lifetime, he would have authorized it himself. Those books are unauthorized. يُعَلِّمُونَ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةِ يُعَلِّمُونَ مَا لَمْ تَكُونُوا تَعْلَمُونَ. The Prophet taught them the book, the law, because the word kitab means the law, and wisdom. So the law and wisdom. Right? So that is Hikmah. مِنَ الْكِتَابِ وَالْحِكْمَةِ يُعَزِّكُمْ بِهِ. and call Allah's favor that is bestowed upon you in the book that He has sent you and the pearls of wisdom on which He has enlightened you. Ayatillah huzwan wazkuru ni'matallahi alaykum wa ma anzala alaykum min al-kitabi wal hikmah wa'lamu anna Allaha bikulli shay'in alim. Again, the word hikmah does not refer to the hadith books. Hikmah. Right, I'm looking at all the occurrences of the word hikmah. He blesses with wisdom whom He wills. My brothers and sisters, you know what? I do not see the connection between what they are arguing for, which is the adoption of hadith books as a parallel, valid source of unquestionable laws, you know, with that constitutes a source of infallible knowledge on a par with the Quran, because that is really what they are arguing for, and the arguments that they are using. Now, yes, you can say hikmah, but it does not tally with what these guys are in fact saying.
After Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals the Quran, preserves the Quran, then it will be upon Him to explain the Quran. And how is that? How do, you know? But it's, the verses suggest that it is separate from the Quran, and that's why the ulama have come and said this is referring to the Sunnah.
No,
just give me a second. I need to look up the verse. I see the few seconds.
Yes, sure.
Yeah. While Farid's looking up that verse, so in Surah An-Nisa, verse 59.
19.
Yeah. So I was going to mention just on that verse for Surah An-Nisa, verse 59 as well. So what's interesting about the ayah of Quran is that it says, obey Allah, obey the Messenger, and those in authority from amongst you. In the Arabic, the word da'a, which is obey or follow, is as a prefix to Allah, prefix to the Prophet, but it's not a prefix to those who are in authority from amongst you. And that's why the scholars say that when it comes to obedience to Allah, it's in its absolute sense, general. But when and the same word is used for the Prophet, so it's general in an absolute sense. But when it comes to wa ulil amri minkum, it's not using the prefix of obedience. So therefore, it is conditional. And then, in fact, the verse continues to go on and says, if you differ upon a matter, then return it back to Allah and His Messenger, whoever believes in Allah on the last day. So even the verse specifies very specifically. Now, I think personally, the reason why a lot of people find some Sunnah rejectors don't find this convincing is because they don't understand how the Arabic language operates within the Quran. They don't understand how the Quran is not, superfluously losing words. Every single word in its form, in its placement, is used for a particular reason. Yeah. So the
so what we need to do is we don't understand the Arabic. The Quran is the words of the Quran are very difficult to understand, and for me, who has spent 2 or 3 years studying Arabic, and who has endless hours and hours of looking at dictionaries, no, I just don't understand it. I need to follow the scholars who have come to this conclusion that the hadith books are the holy words of the Prophet. These hadith books where they say that a woman should breastfeed a man of 18 years old, where they say that a donkey ate up the Quran verses, it was kept under the bed, where it says that a donkey breaks the salah of a woman, where it says that you need to throw a woman with stones to death for the crime of adultery. I need to be ready to accept those words as equivalent or on a par with the Book of Allah. It is a parallel story, and the link, the rooting, the ontology, the founding theory or the founding understanding of the concept is absent. There is no real founding text in the Holy Quran to the Hadith. They haven't established that the books of Bukhari, Muslim, and all these 500,000 traditions have roots, have legitimacy in the Quran. All they've done is they've made an assumption this is what Sunnah is, and then they've operated on that.
Because there's a hukam attached to this, a ruling attached to this. Sorry, Farid.
Yeah, and I heard Sheikh Sharawi rahimahullah mention this point about أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا رسوله وأولي الأمر منكم, and it's very profound. It's as if he's saying أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول, to authorities, and the Prophet ﷺ authority is of course from Allah, but the ta'a to ulil amr is basically conditional on the awliya's ta'a of Allah and the Rasul. So that is actually very, very profound, and I think for somebody who does believe in the Quran, somebody who is a Muslim, they need to take something like that seriously, Sharif. The choice of words, and we know that everything that Allah says in the Quran is said for a reason, and it has a hikmah. So I think that's very important.
Now, let me just take this argument. Let me run with this argument that these good brothers are presenting here. Is that Ati'u Allah wa Ati'u Rasul wa ulil amri minkum. Wa in tanaza'tum fi shay'in, and if you differ in a matter, then refer it back to Allah and His Messenger. Now, let me present you with a problem. You know, in the time of the Khulafa, the Khalifat of the fourth Caliph, Ali alayhi salam, when Ali ruled, right, when he was the ruler, the Caliph, there was a massive dispute. There was a massive, the Quran says, وَإِن تَنَازَعْتُمْ فَرُدُّوا إِلَىٰ. There was a massive dispute between him and the wife of the Prophet Aisha. And there was a massive dispute between him and the companion Muawiyah, right? So, and there was a massive dispute between him and also those who stood on Muawiyah's side, thousands of companions. So if we are to say that you need to refer it back to Allah, because this is really where the verse is relevant. You should obey Allah, you should obey the Messenger and those charged with authority. So why was this verse not implemented? You see, this verse was around at that time. When there was a war between Ali and Muawiyah, why was the verse not implemented? Why was the Quran and the Prophet not invoked to solve the problem? Why was the Quran and the Sunnah not invoked to solve the problem? In fact, this war between Ali and Muawiyah and Aisha, it's still an open wound. It's still a problem. How do we refer it back to the Quran? And how do we refer it back to the Sunnah? If we want to use the Sunnah, the Hadith, to address that problem, because it's an ongoing problem. You see, the problem of the dispute between Imam Ali and the others is a historical issue that splits the Muslim Ummah right up till the present day, where you have wars, we have killing, you have mosques being mosque massacres taking place where Sunnis, I haven't seen a Shia massacring Sunnis, but where Sunnis are massacring Shias in their mosques. So how do you address the issue of the dispute between Imam Ali and those who those who argue that Imam Ali was supposed to be the first Caliph and the rest? And you can't find a solution in the Sunnah, because there are two different traditions, and by Sunnah I mean the Hadith Sunnah, because there are two different Hadith Sunnahs. There's a Shia Hadith Sunnah who invented or who created stories of the Prophet that align with their worldview, and you have a Sunni Sunnah, Hadith Sunnah, that aligns with the way Abu Huraira and all those who supported Muawiyah, how they saw the story. You see, so now you have the Prophet's Hadith. The Prophet's Hadith is divided between Abu Huraira and Ali. So Abu Huraira has a certain view of Muawiyah, which is positive, right? And then Ali and his followers have a certain view that is anti, or that is pro Imam Ali. You cannot use the Hadith to solve the problem. That's my point. So if you say Ruddu ila Allah wa Rasul, refer it back to Allah and His Prophet, the hadith does not fulfill or does not constitute the Sunnah of the Prophet or the obedience of the Prophet that this verse refers to, and it cannot take the place of that verse where that verse says refer it back to the hadiths. It does not answer the problem. Do you see what I mean? So the only solution is that refer it back to Allah and the Prophet means refer it back to the Quran. Refer it back to the Quran. And if you refer it back to the Quran, the problem of Ali and Muawiyah, then the Quran very clearly says, Ati'u Allah wa Ati'u Rasul wa ulil amri minkum. That very same verse states that you have to obey Allah, you have to obey the Prophet and those charged with authority. So if you take that verse alone, then there is a sentence of guilt and transgression on Muawiyah, because Muawiyah is then opposing or transgressing against this very verse, because the verse states that you obey Allah, you obey the Prophet and those with authority, who was Ali. Ali was in authority, legitimately charged with authority. There's no dispute that Imam Ali is a legitimate ruler, the fourth caliph, the first imam, but legitimate, and the actions of Muawiyah are illegitimate. It is in opposition to this very, very verse. And so when there's a dispute and you refer it back to Allah, the answer is very clear, that Muawiyah is the transgressor. But you see, Muslims do not want to accept that. They do not want to accept that Muawiyah is the transgressor. They say Muawiyah is a Sahabi, and it will interfere with their doctrine of all the Sahabis are noble and like the stars, and you can be guided by any one of them. Nonsense. They want to. They don't want the Quran as the mediator. They don't want the Quran to offer the way forward, because the Quran does not satisfy them, and that is the problem. So they have to invent these hadiths. You see the stories of Abu Huraira and all these characters, Ka'b, the Jewish rabbi, and they have to resort to 500,000 stories now in order to render the Quran less effective. And that is the problem we are facing here.
Some of these verses would be incomplete, or the instruction isn't clear. Could you mention some of those maybe?
Yeah, so I mean, one of my approaches with these hadith rejectors, because I was in that position, is that I try to use the Quran to basically debunk their position, because they don't see hadith as a legitimate authority, either because the Sunnah is not an authority in and of itself, or they just think that we can't know whether or not any of it is really true. So really, I think it's a bit of a waste of time to use.
Let me just quickly correct this brother there. They don't use hadith as a legitimate authority. Now, which hadith? There are 500,000 hadiths, and some of them contradict each other. Some of them are pure nonsense. Some of them state that the Prophet instructed a grown woman to breastfeed a grown man. So there are definitely some that are real nonsense. Some of them state that the Prophet kept the Quran, certain verses of the Quran under his bed, and a goat ate those verses. Pure nonsense. So the hadith, you cannot just sweepingly state that people are hadith rejectors. I'm not a hadith rejector. I'm a falsehood rejector. I reject anything that does not admit of reason. And if any hadith comes and it does not admit of reason, I will not adopt it. I will not endorse it. I do not question any verse of the Holy Quran, because those are sacred. The Quran is sacred. And when something is sacred, it means it is untouchable. It is unquestionable. It is eternal. The hadiths are not sacred. They are not eternal. They are not untouchable. They are subject to scrutiny and verification. Any hadith, any word of any man, even if it is ascribed to the Prophet. Because by merely ascribing words to the Prophet, you do not add and automatically a sense of sacredness to it. Because some of these people who have ascribed words to the Prophet are liars, are con men, and we cannot use it automatically as proof. And this is the argument that we are being fed here.
Hadith to try to prove hadith, when many times these people, they're not concerned with it. You have to start from the Quran, which is a source that they accept, and demonstrate that you can't even really understand the Quran without recourse to.
You see, now, this is a crazy attitude here, which is a source they accept. Which is a source they accept. It's almost like, it's slightly almost like casting a negative aspersion on people for using this source which they accept. So it's almost like casting those who view the Quran as the sole sacred text and narrative as somehow deficient or lacking, and they need to be thrown out of that state of deficiency that they find themselves in.
To some other material. I mean, you can tell by reading the Quran, and this is something that I appreciated over time, especially having conversations with people, that the Quran assumes many times that the reader actually has information apart from it. So, if, for example, it mentions, and this is, people think that these are trivial things, but they're actually important. I mean, when the Quran mentions the 4 sacred months and it talks about Hajj and these different things, it assumes, because actually the wording that's used, it says these are the well-known months. Now, it doesn't actually go and list off and tell you what those well-known months are, because it's assuming that, first of all, the immediate people that were around during the revelation knew what they were. They had access to the Prophet alayhi salam, and they knew what these things were. Now, us today, if we don't have that access, we have to have some other material to go to, and that's what the Sunnah is. It provides.
Here comes another really weak argument, and what this brother is saying here is that the Quran does not fill in the details, and we need the Sunnah in order to get those details, and he uses the example of the sacred months. You see, the problem that he is making is he's drawing wild inferences. Now, nobody is denying or disputing the need for historical information. The Quran says, travel through the earth and see what was the outcome of those before you. The Quran does not state that all knowledge resides in the Quran. That is absolutely a bogus position, to say that all knowledge resides in the Quran. Absolutely not. The Quran, in fact, challenges you to look at nature, to travel through the earth, to study history. And so for us to say that we need to understand the context and the history of the Arabs and of the life of the Prophet and of the life subsequent to the Prophet, the wars between the Muslims, we are not the history of Pharaoh, of the ancient Egyptians, of the Greeks, of the Romans. We are not. History is a legitimate and encouraged field of study according to the Quran. The Quran says travel and see what was the outcome of those who lived before. So history is a legitimate field of study. We are not disputing the need for scholarship and study, whether it is scholarship into nature, science, whether it is scholarship into mathematics, whether it is science and scholarship as far as history is concerned. But you cannot say that any study of history and of science are necessarily sacred and on a par with the Quran. You see, the Quran are the sacred perimeters, are the sacred injunctions, the sacred commands of Allah. It is the sacred framework within which all other scholarship should take place. Now, what this brother is arguing is that because you reject the sacredness of hadith, then you won't understand anything in the Quran. No, of course not. Linguistics, the study of Arabic, we need to study these fields. And as far as the 4 sacred months, yes, we should look into history and see what were those months. Look at the physical evidence, look at the inscriptions, the rock inscriptions, look at the empirical evidence of history, the multiple attestations that came down from history. But remember, history is based, the gold standard for history is multiple attestation, independent attestation. It is when more than one person attests to the same event. Right now, let's take an example: the Battle of Karbala, for example, the war between Hussein and the army of Yazid, is multiply attested to. It is an event that can be that has been clearly documented through multiple channels of narration. But the event of Karbala in itself is not a sacred injunction from Allah. It is just verified history. And what I'm saying is that hadiths can play the role of elucidating or providing context, but surely they do not provide sacred content. And multiple attestation is the key word. You see, multiple attestation eliminates the possibility that one man, whether he's a Sahabi or not, could fabricate an event in history. Right? So we cannot rely on one man reports. Now I'm going to tell you something now. Most of the hadiths in Bukhari are one man reports. They are not multiply attested to. When Abu Huraira said that a black dog and a donkey breaks the salah, or a woman breaks the salah, he was alone. He was a sole narrator of that words of the Prophet. So it's not multiply attested in any case. Most hadiths are not multiply attested. They are what we call khabar ahad. They go back to one man's opinion or one man's experience. And that one man is, in most of the cases, Abu Huraira. So your hadith is basically what you are promoting is Abu Huraira. His singular view. In many cases, he's the only one. And he's being opposed in many of his views by other Sahabis also.
Contextualization for these type of verses. Otherwise, there are plenty of things that Allah commands in the Quran that we would not really be able to obey or be able to follow because we just don't have enough information to fully understand what the command actually is. And it seems, and I got to a point where you either have to do one of two things. You either have to reinterpret things so much to just completely butcher the Arabic language for it to be saying something other than what it was originally intended, and then you just have a totally different religion, or you have to say, well, yeah, this is what it means, and then somehow deal with the lack of details for how to actually carry out commands or certain religious practices. And it's a problem either way you go. So what I do is I try to point out, first of all, certain things in the Quran that we're expected to do that we wouldn't be able to do unless we had other information, whether it be specifically with things of a ritualistic nature, whether it be Hajj, whether it be Siyam, fasting for Ramadan, whether it be praying, which you're supposed to do every day. All of these things, we would not be able to really carry them out unless we had access to other information. Even
okay, let's deal with this argument. I think we've got the gist of the argument there, and that is that if there was no hadiths or books of hadith, then you wouldn't understand the salah and hajj and all these things like ritual, these rituals. Let me remind this guy that the hadiths only arrived around 300 years after the death of the Prophet. So there's no hadith for 200 years, for about 5 or 6 generations, there's no hadith. How did they know how to make salah? There was no hadith books. I bring you to another argument. Abu Hanifa is the biggest madhab, the most adherents, the most followers in the Muslim world of any fiqh madhab. I know how to make salah, how to fast, etc. He precedes Bukhari. Now, how do you, your argument doesn't hold, because what you are saying is that Bukhari is the basis to how to make salah, but Bukhari came after the biggest madhab. Doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. Abu Hanifa is the biggest madhab. Bukhari comes 100, 200 years after Bukhari. So he's not the basis of the Hanafi madhab. So how do you explain that? So the fact of the matter is, this whole argument that you need hadiths, it's a circular argument, because you've assumed salah to be a ritual, to be a detailed ritual. You've made that assumption. You now have to go and invent hadiths to justify why salah is a ritual. The Quran never states that salah is a ritual. It never states it. The word salah occurs 80 something times in the Quran. Never ever amounts to in any way to a ritual. Salah is a gathering, is a get together. It is a period of exchange. It is it's a session of connection between the believers, those who want to edify, want to fortify their iman, their strength, they believe in Allah, their own lives, who want to strengthen the commandments or the injunctions of Allah, the commands of Allah within their own lives and within their society. They are edified with Quran, and that is what salah is. Salah is a process of connecting with Allah's will, with the words of Allah, connecting with your fellow believers. And that is, yes, partially is what we do when we make the ritual salah. But it is not a ritual just to go and through the actions, through the kata, that constitutes the salah of today. That is not it. So you're trying to prove what you've already assumed, and then you are saying that the Quran is weak, it's not enough because it's not giving details to salah. No, Allah has done a perfect job of the Quran. We don't need Abu Hurairah. Abu Hurairah worked for the Umayyads, who were killers and murderers and thieves. We don't take our Islam from killers, murderers and thieves. No ways. And neither from those who worked for those killers, murderers and thieves. The Quran on its own is sacred, and you don't need to dig up a whole body of hadith to make the Quran have better meaning. That surely is not what the Quran requires.
Historical things. I mean, the Quran doesn't really explicitly tell the details of the Prophet's life, any biography about him. We wouldn't really know any of that information. It just assumes that the reader is going to have access to something else. So there's all...
if you are going to try and claim that the biographers of the Prophet, Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham, these are the original biographers of the Prophet, and these guys lived more than a century after the Prophet, and much of their information is agreed. Ibn Ishaq's work is commonly known that it contains Israeliyat. There is no sound seerah of the Prophet within the books. There is no sound seerah. The seerah of the Prophet has not been documented in the lifetime of the Prophet. The earliest seerah comes more than a century after the Prophet. Now you sit and think back 150 years. Where were you 150 years? Think about it. It's a patchwork of conjecture and Israeliyat, and there is no solid seerah. We have to patch together a history of the Prophet, and the best source of history is actually the Quran. The Quran does recall certain landmark events in the time of the Prophet, like the Battle of Badr, like the early years at Mecca, how he was treated by the enemies. The essential features of the seerah, the fact that he fought in battles, that he confronted the enemies, that he had multiple wives, that he had good and bad companions. These are all captured in the Quran, but people don't draw the seerah from the Quran. The Quran very clearly stipulates that there were evil companions in the time of the Prophet. Go and read the Surah Tawbah, and you will see that there were companions that were lagging, that were refusing to fight with the Prophet. They were companions, but But people do not want to draw the seerah from the Quran. They want to invent this fantastic or fabulous history that they've concocted from false sources also.
All sorts of problems. But I think at the core, this approach, it takes care of all of the different permutations of the Quranist perspective, right? Because it deals with the person who thinks that the Sunnah is not authority whatsoever, because it's demonstrating, well, if you don't think it's an authority and you don't have this other information, then you can't really even follow the Quran properly. So it deals with that issue. And then secondly, it deals with the issue of,
if you don't follow the Sunnah, then you can't follow the Quran. Completely null and void argument there. Makes no sense.
Well, maybe the Prophet was authoritative in some sense apart from the Quran, but the information that we have is just not on, it doesn't have, it's not sound enough in order to establish that it's actually from the Prophet, right? Now, if you say for the sake of argument it's not, what I would argue is, in some sense, you have to reject the Quran or just leave so many of these matters open, and you have no way to really follow the Quran properly. So I think
that's a big lie. I mean, how can you not know how to follow the Quran? The Quran is a text. It's clear. It's English. It's Arabic. There's no reason you should reject the Quran just because you're rejecting this false body of hadiths.
Using the Quran in this way and putting it on the hadith rejector to try to make sense of some of these things from the Quran alone is going to be very difficult. I mean, it's a legitimate procedure even amongst us Sunnis. We have tafsir, Quran bil Quran. We have this concept where you can actually make tafsir based on verses of the Quran. But what most scholars realize is there's limitations to this. They still use other information outside of the Quran. And what I try to establish is that
there are no limitations, because if you apply your mind, if you apply your rational mind, if you study history, if you study all other necessary fields of study like science and biology and astronomy, you will be enlightened. The Quran will be an enlightening reference or an enlightening source of wisdom. Nobody is saying that you should study the Quran without a bigger understanding of nature and of history. What we are arguing is that hadiths, simply by virtue of being hadith, does not make it more sacred than any other field of study.
Unless you do, the tafsir of the Quran can only get you so far. Unless you have this other information, you're going to be lost on many of these different topics. So I think that's a real issue. And then, oddly enough, I think, and I'm sorry for going on long enough, but kind of dovetailing on what Sharif and Freed mentioned about this whole issue of liberalism and, being...
Okay, let's just quickly deal with that finish of that argument, because he's moving on to a new argument. But the point there is basically that you need the other information in order to understand the Quran. I'm in full agreement. You need... The Quran is fully understandable on its own, but you will achieve, or you will unlock more enrichment and knowledge from the Quran should you study history, science, biology, human physiology, because the Quran does refer to human physiology. It refers to astronomy, it refers to the origins of the universe, it refers to history and events of history prior to the Prophet and during the Prophet's lifetime. And so this is what is called a straw man argument. You are stating that those who use the Quran as an a priori and primary source are automatically rejecting any other knowledge and information, which is false. How can you do that? You need to know Arabic before you can know the Quran, in fact. So Arabic is already a required source or field of study to understand the original Arabic language Quran. So that was a clear straw man argument, and it does not prove the point that hadiths are sacred. Let's move on to another argument now, because what is going to question now is the motivation or the reason why people reject hadith. And what he's going to say is that people reject hadith because hadith are illiberal. It is conservative. It seems ridiculous, or it seems barbaric.
Raised in a secular society and having problems with some hadith and this and that, that's definitely a motivation. Some of them, I think it's a real motivation for them, even if they won't explicitly admit it, but that's a whole nother issue. But oddly enough, without the Sunnah, many things that they think they would have a problem with the hadith, they should have a problem with the Quran, and that without access to the Sunnah, they wouldn't be able to contextualize some of those things. Controversial things like in chapter 4, verse 34, everybody knows the verse where it talks about, supposedly beating the wife and what exactly that means. Without the Sunnah to really clarify the context of what that means, it's left open to interpretation. You could say, well, yeah, I could just totally beat the crap out of my wife for no apparent reason. I mean, it doesn't explain that. The Sunnah is actually what gives a context to it to make it seem, for lack of better words, less harsh than it would seem from the Quran alone, which is the very thing that they're worried about. I mean, also you have the issue with the punishment for the thief. I mean, it mentions chopping the hand off for the thief. Well, it doesn't go through the detailed explanation of when that should be done, when it shouldn't be done. If I just read that verse, I could say, well, if the guy goes down the street and, for all I know, he was hungry, but he had nothing to eat and he stole an apple from a local vegetable or a fruit stand, well, chop his hand off. I mean, what's stopping me from interpreting the verse of the Quran that way without access to the Sunnah? So the point...
Okay, I think we get the gist. Let me just quickly summarize that I'm understanding it correctly here. What he's arguing here is that those who choose to prefer the Quran as the sole sacred text the reason they take that position of denying the sacred value of hadith is because they feel embarrassed by some of the hadiths. And clearly that is true. I mean, many of the hadiths are clearly embarrassing, like the hadith in Ibn Majah or Abu Dawud that states that a grown woman can breastfeed a woman can breastfeed a grown man in order for them to become mahram, or for her to be in his company alone. All she has to do is breastfeed, and the fatwa from the Al-Azhar to that effect that professional women can also share office space with men by breastfeeding those men in the office. Clearly, I think his point is valid, that hadiths are embarrassing for their nonsense, for their sheer ridiculous content. There are other hadiths that are also ridiculous, but let me just I think that one takes the cake. The adult men in the office breastfeeding from a woman in order for them to be alone in the office with him. So hadith, yes, we do reject it because it is on its face ridiculous and embarrassing. But then he goes on to say, but you know what? That is a false way from which to reject hadith. I think that's a very valid way. If something doesn't pass the smell test, if it seems ridiculous and abhorrent, it is probably false, because we do have inbuilt senses of what is true and what is wholesome. But now what he goes on to do then is to say that the Quran includes equally ridiculous or extremist views which will be embarrassing in a liberal society. Now that there oversteps the mark, because then he takes two examples. He speaks about the example in Surah An-Nisa where Allah says that you should fadribuhunna. Let's call up this verse and see if it stands the test of, as this brother says, being an embarrassing verse in the Quran, something that we will want to run away from. And I'm going to specifically use the translation of Yusuf Ali. Right? In Yusuf Ali's translation states, to save time, I'll read the Arabic. Men are the protectors and maintainers of women, because Allah has given the one more strength than the other. I'm not embarrassed by those words. Men have an advantage in terms of physical strength, and because they support them from their means, and they are the ones that have the advantage during the times of confinement, of birth, and pregnancy, that men have physically an advantage. They can continue to work and provide, and because they support them, right? Therefore, the righteous women are devoutly obedient and guard in the husband's absence what Allah would have them guard. So that means there will be times when women are in charge of the possessions or the assets of the man. As to those women on whose part you fear disloyalty and ill conduct, the word is nushuz zahunna. If you fear disloyalty, in other words, the betrayal of your trust, admonish them, fa'izuhunna, then admonish them or counsel them. If they are disloyal, if they betray the trust, right? If you have left much in their care and they have betrayed it, then admonish them. Next, fahjuruhunna fi madajiri, then refuse to share beds with them. And lastly, wadribuhunna, and if they, and I'm just going by Yusuf Ali's translation, right? Next, and beat them. The word lightly is inserted, that's not in the verse. Beat them, but if they return to obedience, seek not against them means of annoyance, for Allah is most high, great above you all. Now, you know what? I happen to not agree with a particular interpretation of the word darabaya. I don't see it as meaning to beat women, right? And in fact, in Muhammad Asad's translation, in Yusuf Muhammad Ali's translation, and in the new translation, the Ascendant Quran by Sheikh Muhammad Al-Asi, they all agree with me that the word beat has multiple meanings. In other places in the Quran, you'll find the word beat refer to traveling or going out. And so there are ways of the word daraba not simply being amounting to beating. Because if you look at it in context, then the preceding verses all instruct men to be kind and loving. And there is the famous, when we marry, we use Quranic words. When we marry, we say uzawwijuka. When you marry, and I've married some men to some women and men, and the words we state as the marriage officer, you state the following: uzawwijuka ala ma amara Allahu bi, I marry you on what Allah commanded, bihi min imsakin bi ma'rufin, to hold together as husband and wife in bil ma'ruf, in what is commonly kind and decent, aw tasrihin bi ihsan, or to part in a respectful way. So the seerah, the whole basis of marriage, which is found in the Holy Quran, because the Quran instructs men and women with imsak bi ma'ruf, to be married on good terms, or to separate in kindness, or tasrihin bi ihsan. So the whole principle in the Quran is you stay together as married people in kindness, and according to what is decent and commonly good, or you separate with politeness. The whole idea of beating does not feature. You see, beating is not a third option. You're not married and then you have a fight. You have a physical fight. That alam ma amar Allah, what you are married, imsak bi ma'ruf. You are married on equitable and kind terms. There's no beating involved there. أو تصريح بإحسان or separation. The two options are you are married with respect and kindness, or you are separated, you are divorced with decency and with respect. So the whole idea of beating just from the Quran is eliminated here. And we must remember that the Quran, the Arabic language, and our understanding is limited. The Quran is not limited in its wisdom and in its truth. But we have to exert the effort. Before you go and beat up your wife, you need to make dead sure that you've understood the verses correctly. Because if you should be making a mistake, if you yourself have been weak in understanding, then it is on you, not on the Quran.
Apart from the Sunnah, many times it actually gives context for these things in the Quran that seem very harsh to restrict them in some sense. And if you only have the Quran, I would argue you would have a bigger problem. And to try to avoid that and contextualize it from the Quran alone, that makes it palatable for a liberal and secular audience.
So he says the Hadith makes the Quran more palatable. How does the Hadith make beating women more palatable? Answer me that, because you've taken the example of beating. You've given that. I didn't give that example. You gave it, and then you said that the Hadith will make it more palatable. How does it make it more palatable? No ways. We have to deal with the Quran and with the words in the Quran. The Hadith doesn't say you must beat them lightly or you must beat them with a feather. There's absolutely no record of the Prophet ever beating his wife. If you are trying to say that the Sunnah is bears it out,
I think is going to be very difficult, and the Sunnah actually makes that easier in many cases.
Where the Sunnah doesn't. There's no Hadith that says.
I mean, thanks, Jake. That
you shouldn't
was
beat
really
your
good.
wife.
And just a comment there, just to clarify. I mean, I think generally speaking, like you mentioned the verse about beating your wife. I think it can be said that that can be contextualized through the Quran in a way where you can't just go and like completely beat the crap out of your wife with zero restriction. I think you beat her close to death. I think you can argue for that, but I think the general picture you're putting forward is that if we,
I think this brother Abdul, he's kind of like intervening here. He himself feels that this guy at the bottom with the red cap is baiting an embarrassing situation where beating, the Quran naturally does present beating as a legitimate course of action or activity during the marriage.
Don't have external information, then a lot of these commandments and a lot of the things mentioned in the Quran almost appear out of context. It almost assumes that you have this external source that's going to guide you on how to implement these things, and I think you can even see that in the language. So
and I think that listen, I'm not advocating for this type of beating or anything from the Quranic perspective, but I'm saying, because I know from being in these circles that these guys struggle with that type of stuff, and because they don't have a tradition to even base their whether or not their interpretations of certain texts are legitimate. Like, we have a tradition with scholarship, and we have access to the Sunnah that we can actually look at and study with a scholar. They don't have any of that. So if I wanted to, what I'm saying is, if I wanted to, and I had that, as many, I think, Christians and atheists unfortunately do, have that evil intent within them to manipulate the Quranic text, it's much easier to do apart from the Sunnah. And that trying to respond to those things and make arguments to contextualize them, yes, you can do it, but I don't think it's very easy to do with the Quran alone. That's what I'm trying to say, especially when
I don't know, I'm trying to get behind his argument here. You see, what he's trying to say is that because we have priests and because we have tens of or hundreds of thousands of hadiths, we can almost like feel more comfortable that the Quran says you must beat up your wife. It gives us backup, you know. And if you don't believe in the priests and you don't believe in the millions or 500,000 hadiths, then you're on your own and the Quran becomes a problem and you have to reinterpret and recontextualize the verses. Why? I don't feel like that. I mean, if the Quran says you should, if the Quran really meant beat, and if it was clear, which it is not, because the word beating is used many times. That word daraba appears in the Quran. If you look at the word daraba, I can show you. I just don't have the time in this video. You go and search. The word daraba in the Quran means to travel, to get out, to go off. It has many other meanings. And you see, then you must also realize that there's something called metaphor in language. The Quran is written in a medium that was created by human beings. And human beings employ metaphor. What is metaphor? Metaphor is using words with a literal meaning to reflect meaning that are not literal. For example, if you say to somebody, beat it, you are actually telling him, go away. Now we can go and seek, why does the language employ the word beat it to refer to go away? If you search, you might find that, you know, at some point in history, you had to beat the horse in front of the wagon for him to travel and for him to walk. And then, you know, the word beat it is a remnant, or is a leftover from an antiquated or an archaic practice of the past, where you had to beat the horse in order to set off on your journey or to go. So we must remember that we need to understand the Quran in its spirit. The spirit of the Quran is one of mercy, kindness, love, respect. The Quran abhors violence. It is no secret. The Quran abhors, the Quran hates. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hates violence and hurting people and suffering. And suffering and violence are we're always restrained when it comes to violence and suffering. So why would you, in that greater context of love, harmony, and kindness between husband and wife, why would we easily assume that to smack your wife around and to kick your wife around it doesn't fit into the greater reality, the greater image or environment which the Quran promotes, which is one of love, harmony, respect, justice, and kindness.
When it comes to the issue of the thief, I mean, what are the circumstances in which this punishment is carried out for the thief? When is it not? What's the appropriateness of it? Is it one hand or is it two hands? Do you do both of them at the same time? I mean, all of these kind of things, I think, are not really explicitly explained in the Quran.
Yeah.
Okay, just a moment on that one also. The Quran does state that the hand of the thief should be cut. Let's look at that verse quickly. This verse says, as to the thief, male or female, cut off his or her hands. فَانْقَطَعُوا أَيْدِيَهُمَا جَزَاءً بِمَا. So a punishment by way of example from Allah for their crime, and Allah is exalted in power. Right, so that's the verse. Now firstly, let me just say, if that is the meaning, and if we as researchers and readers of the Quran come to a unanimous conclusion that the meaning is that the thief should be amputated, within the greater context of mercy, because remember, mercy is a requirement. Allah loves those who are measured and who are restrained in their activities. You cannot read the Quran, the verses, as an enemy of truth, as an enemy of kindness, as an enemy of mercy. You have to read every verse in the context of love and mercy. And so if you feel that somebody has stolen an apple at somebody's fruit stall, and you want to cut off his hands, you are obviously acting in contradiction with the whole ethos of mercy and kindness. But if you find that the king of Saudi Arabia has stolen millions, or Muawiyah or Yazid of the Muslim nation, of the Muslim treasury, of the national treasury, then they are the ones that the verse refers to. And I would have no qualms with those guys having their hands amputated, because the losses they cause, the losses in terms of poverty, in terms of suffering that is caused by corruption, believe me, we would solve a lot of problems. And I'm not in no way embarrassed by this verse. But if you're telling me the verse should be interpreted to punish a 10-year-old child who stole an apple at the store, absolutely not. It's against the whole ethos of the Quran. And only a fool and an enemy of the Quran will make that kind of foolish deduction. Somebody who has not read the Quran really, and who's trying to use the Quran as a support for his own sadism. The Quran is not a sadist book. Islam is not a sadist religion. What we do is always to the greater good and in fulfillment of our duty towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I think I've more or less covered enough for this episode, and wudu one is going to be not possible, so I will proceed with one on the wudu after this one. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.